April 1974. The morning sun over the Nevada desert rose like a slow-burning fuse, painting the empty horizon in orange fire. At Groom Lake, an air base that officially didn't exist, Captain James Hawkeye Reddick stood facing something he never expected to see sitting on American soil: a fully intact Soviet Yak-36 Freehand, the USSR's experimental vertical takeoff fighter. It looked nothing like the sleek American prototypes parked silently in nearby hangars. Where American engineers favored smooth curves and aerodynamic beauty, the Yak-36 looked like it had been welded together in a hurry by a mechanic working against a deadline. Its nose was blunt, its fuselage short and fat, with two massive vectoring nozzles hanging beneath it like the hips of a stubborn mule. Yet Reddick couldn't take his eyes off it. The aircraft had arrived in the dead of night, a disassembled puzzle smuggled out of Eastern Europe through a covert chain involving defectors, forged manifests, and 3 intelligence agencies that swore they had nothing to do with it. The crates were stamped with false agricultural labels, but the moment the lids were pried open and the first dull blue panel was revealed, the atmosphere on base shifted. Project name: Have Flare. Officially, never happened. The commanding colonel's briefing had been blunt. "This thing isn't pretty," he'd said, tapping a grainy photograph of the Soviet jet. "But Moscow poured half a decade of resources into making it work. We need to know if they succeeded. Captain Reddick, you will be the first American to fly it." Reddick had flown everything with wings, from F-104s that felt like supersonic spears to experimental thrust vectoring platforms that nearly shook themselves apart. But nothing had prepared him for the Freehand. Now, standing 3 feet from it, he felt as if he were examining a captured animal. Dangerous, unpredictable, almost insulted to be here. A mechanic nudged him. "Can't believe this bucket of bolts ever got off the ground." But Reddick knew better. He had spent the last week buried in translated Soviet manuals, diagrams, and maintenance notes. What struck him wasn't the complexity of the aircraft. Far from it. It was the ruthless simplicity. Soviet engineers had built the Yak-36 with a single philosophy: if the pilot can understand it in 10 minutes, then anyone can fly it. Most panels opened with the same size wrench. Wiring harnesses were color-coded in broad, almost childlike shades so mechanics could repair them in snowstorms or at night. And the controls? Brutally straightforward. Where American VTOL test aircraft had labyrinths of sensors, stabilization computers, and emergency override logic, the Yak-36 had levers. Literal levers. Mechanical linkages. Springs. Crude, yes, but fail-safe. And that terrified him far more than any advanced Soviet avionics would have. The cockpit felt like a steel coffin. Reddick eased himself in, knees grazing every surface. Cyrillic labels covered the instrument panel, but most gauges needed no translation. Altitude, fuel, temperature, main vector pitch. Simple needles, simple dials. The flight manual was only 47 pages long. 47. The American equivalent for the experimental 15-5 vertifan had been thick enough to stop a bullet. As he strapped in, he remembered something an intelligence analyst had told him. Don't look for elegance in Soviet designs. Look for the invisible equation. How quickly can we replace this if it explodes? He wasn't laughing now. Ground crews pulled away. 2 chase aircraft, modified A-7 Corsairs, waited at the far end of the runway. Reddick flipped the battery switches. The Yak-36 came alive with a low, metallic groan. Vibration crawled up his legs, into his spine. Flare 1, this is Groom Tower. You are clear for static hover test. Reddick swallowed. Copy. He pushed the throttle. The twin lift engines screamed like wounded beasts. The aircraft trembled violently, the entire frame shaking as if trying to escape his grip. For a split second, he thought it would tear itself apart. Then, like a stubborn mule grudgingly obeying, it rose. 2 feet. 4. 6. Dust spiraled beneath him, turning into a wild storm under the downward jet blast. The Yak wobbled like a drunk tightrope walker. His heartbeat tripled. American VTOL prototypes had sophisticated gyros that quietly corrected instability. The Yak-36 had none of that. If it tilted too far, it simply fell. Reddick fought the stick with both hands. Sweat pooled instantly on his palms. But then something clicked. Yes, the aircraft was unstable. Yes, it tried to kill him with every second of hover. But its reactions were consistent. Predictable, even. No hidden logic. No sudden computer corrections. It was pure machine. And if you treated it with respect, if you anticipated its twitching tendencies, it obeyed. He held it for 30 seconds. Then 40. Then a full minute. The tower erupted in cheers. He set the aircraft down, hard, but intact. When the engines finally spooled down, Reddick's hands were shaking so badly he could barely undo the harness. But beneath the fear was something else. Admiration. He understood now. The Yak-36 wasn't trying to match American engineering. It was trying to bypass it entirely. It wasn't a masterpiece. It was a battlefield tool. And a tool that could be understood by any pilot with a steady hand wasn't something to underestimate. 3 days later, he was cleared for transition to forward flight. The entire facility gathered at dawn, watching the strange blue aircraft taxi out like an animal that had survived extinction. Wind whipped across the lake bed. Reddick ran the pre-flight checklist, shortest he'd ever seen, and took a deep breath. Flare 1, clear to lift. He eased the throttle forward. The lift engines roared, and again the plane shook like a leaf in a storm. He rose to 30 feet, stabilized, then nudged the nozzle lever. Slowly, painfully, the nose dipped forward. Airspeed climbed. The shaking grew worse. The controls felt like wrestling a stubborn bull. Then, the forward engine caught full airflow. A sudden surge. A violent shove. The aircraft lurched ahead. He felt it instantly. The aircraft didn't want to fly smoothly. It wanted to leap, just like the MiG-21's brutal climb in those famous Have Donut reports. Soviet aircraft weren't built for comfort. They were built for short, decisive bursts of violence. At 200 knots, the Yak transformed. The shaking faded. Controls sharpened. The stubby wings bit into the air. For the first time, Reddick felt the aircraft's true nature. It wasn't meant to hover gracefully. It was meant to launch from improvised fields, sprint into combat, unleash chaos, and vanish. The Soviets hadn't built it to be the best VTOL aircraft. They'd built it to be good enough, fast enough, and cheap enough to outlast whatever America threw at it. And that thought chilled him more than any onboard warning light ever could. The transition to full forward flight ended with Reddick leveling off at 12,000 feet, slicing through the desert air with a confidence he hadn't expected to feel. The Yak-36, this odd little Soviet creature, was suddenly smooth, almost gentle, as if relieved to no longer defy gravity the hard way. Below him, the dry lake bed stretched like a cracked plate, framed by the serrated mountains of Nevada. Flare 1, how are your controls? The chase pilot's voice cracked through the headset. Responsive, Reddick replied. A little twitchy in roll. Feels nose-heavy at low throttle. He paused. But it flies. Really flies. On the ground, engineers leaned close to their monitors. Intelligence officers scribbled furiously. For months they'd speculated whether the Soviets were bluffing, whether the Yak-36 was nothing but propaganda, a paper promise of futuristic technology. But now, an American pilot was in the sky, proving otherwise. Reddick banked left. The aircraft followed immediately, almost too enthusiastically. He laughed. Oh, you're eager, aren't you? He pushed the throttle. The main engine responded with a throaty roar, and the sky opened in front of him. The stubby wings held steady. Vibrations fell to almost nothing. If the hover portion was an act of brute force and stubbornness, forward flight was revelation. This was the Soviet secret. Not elegance, not grace, but the elimination of everything unnecessary. The aircraft didn't try to protect the pilot from himself. It didn't filter his inputs. It didn't smooth over mistakes. It simply obeyed. And in combat, obedience, instant obedience, could be deadlier than perfection. Reddick began the first of several performance tests. Acceleration runs, energy maneuvers, rate of climb profiles. The Yak responded like a high-strung animal, eager to break free of its restraints. The chase pilot whistled. Jesus, Flare 1. That thing jumps. Soviets gave it muscle where it counts, Reddick replied. Ugly as sin, though. Reddick smirked. Sometimes ugly wins. He dove to 8,000 feet, pulled a tight 4G turn, and rolled out cleanly. The Yak held together better than anyone expected. No frame shudder, no wing flutter. Sure, it lacked refinement. Certain flight transitions felt rough, as though the parts themselves were arguing about which direction to go. But it held, despite its simplicity, despite its cheapness, despite everything American engineers would have considered unacceptable. And that was the problem. If the Soviets could churn out hundreds of these in wartime, crude but functional, then the tactical implications were enormous. NATO analysts had always feared high-end Soviet fighters like the MiG-25. But perhaps the real danger lay in aircraft like this one. Machines that could be built quickly, flown by average pilots, maintained under miserable conditions, and sacrificed without hesitation. Quantity had a quality of its own. Reddick completed the high-speed portion of the test, then climbed to 15,000 feet to prepare for re-entry into hover, the most dangerous part of the flight. More Soviet pilot-eating accidents had occurred during the transition from forward flight to vertical descent than from any other phase. His palms were damp again. Flare 1. You're clear for transition, the tower said. Reddick exhaled. Roger. Initiating. He reduced throttle. Airspeed bled off quickly. He shifted the vectoring lever. The nose pitched upward, not smoothly, but in shuddering increments, like shifting an old mechanical gearbox. The lift engines spooled up, their high-pitched scream flooding the cockpit. The aircraft shook violently. Warning lights flickered. Reddick clenched the stick, keeping the attitude indicator centered. Easy, easy. At 80 knots, the Yak began to fight him. Not dangerously, just stubbornly. Like the aircraft was reminding him it wasn't designed to make this easy. 60 knots. 40. 20. The desert floor hovered beneath him. Flare 1. You are stable, the tower confirmed. Stable was generous. The Yak wobbled like a table with uneven legs. Reddick compensated with constant microcorrections. It felt as if every gust of wind carried malice. Then, finally, he was hovering. He lowered the aircraft down, 1 foot at a time. Dust spiraled. The lift engines groaned. The landing gear absorbed the impact with a heavy metallic thunk. And then silence. He did it. He had flown, transitioned, maneuvered, and landed the first captured Soviet VTOL aircraft ever tested on American soil. When he climbed out, his legs nearly buckled. Mechanics clapped. Engineers swarmed the jet. Intelligence officers whispered urgently among themselves. The colonel approached, expression unreadable. Well, he asked. Reddick wiped his forehead. Sir, it's rough. It's unforgiving. It's unstable. He paused. But it works. The colonel grunted. What's your tactical assessment? Reddick hesitated, then spoke the truth. If they mass-produce these, they'll have an aircraft that can take off from patches of asphalt the size of a tennis court. They won't need air bases. They won't need infrastructure. They'll hide them in forests, under bridges, in barns. And the quality? Reddick shrugged. Irrelevant. They can build 10 for every one of ours. The colonel's jaw tightened. He already knew what that meant. In a long war, an attrition war, the side with a cheap, replaceable VTOL swarm could cripple the other's logistical backbone. America built its fighters as jewels, expensive, advanced, irreplaceable. But the Yak-36 was a disposable dagger. A nation could lose hundreds and still keep fighting. That night, while the base slept, Reddick reviewed the cockpit tapes. He replayed the transitions, the hover, the maneuvering, the vibrations in the fuselage, the lean angles, the rate of throttle response, and an unsettling realization settled over him. The Yak-36 wasn't actually a bad aircraft. It was an honest one, designed for the kind of war American engineers prayed never to face. A war where runways were bombed to gravel, fuel convoys were cut off, and maintenance crews survived on scrap metal and resolve. A war of desperation, not doctrine. He leaned back in the chair. If Soviet engineers had embraced minimalism this effectively in an early VTOL experiment, what else were they quietly perfecting? 2 weeks later, the second phase began, combat simulations. Reddick found himself once again strapped into the crude steel cockpit, this time facing 2A-7 Corsairs in a mock engagement over the restricted test range. Flare 1. You are weapons-free for simulated IR missile shots. Reddick smiled. Let's see what you've got, Freehand. The Corsairs flanked him. Sleek, deadly, far more advanced. But the moment the test started, the Yak revealed its secret weapon. Acceleration. Pure, brutal acceleration. Reddick shoved the throttle, and the Yak lunged forward so violently he felt the straps bite into his shoulders. The Corsairs overshot instantly. "Whoa! Flare! One just vanished," one of the chase pilots shouted. Reddick banked hard, yanking the aircraft into a tight vertical loop. The G-load hammered him, but the Soviet frame held. He dropped behind the first Corsair. Beep, beep, beep. Simulated lock tone. Guns, guns, guns. The second Corsair dove for the deck. Reddick followed, the yak slicing downward like a falling axe. At low altitude, the aircraft became twitchy again, but he stayed with it, anticipating each wobble. He slipped into firing position. Another lock. Another kill. 2 kills in under 40 seconds. Silence filled the radio for a moment. Then someone muttered, "What the hell?" Reddick pulled level and exhaled shakily. The truth was undeniable now. This ugly Soviet prototype, designed in a different universe of engineering philosophy, could outmaneuver frontline American attack jets in the opening seconds of a fight. Not because it was better, but because it was simple, obedient, expendable, and because the Soviets understood something the West had forgotten. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon is the one you can afford to lose. The desert winds were rising again, thin, sharp, and restless, as though the Nevada landscape sensed that something important was shifting inside Groom Lake's invisible boundaries. Captain James Reddick stood on the observation platform hours after sunset, staring at the dim silhouette of the Yak-36 under floodlights. The aircraft looked strangely peaceful, as if unaware of the storm it had stirred within American aviation doctrine. His hands rested on the railing, knuckles pale. He had flown enemy fighters before. He had evaluated foreign technology. But nothing, not the MiG-17s they dragged out of scrapyards in Asia, not the battered Cuban MiG-21s, had left him feeling quite like this. Because the Yak-36 wasn't a threat due to brilliance. It was a threat because it ignored the rules. Rules that American aircraft lived and died by. The next morning began Phase 3, reliability testing. The engineers wanted to know how many cycles the Soviet engines could withstand, how quickly the airframe fatigued, how sensitive the lift nozzles were to heat and dust. These were usually dry tests, numbers, graphs, temperatures. But the Yak resisted being reduced to data. On the first engine start sequence, a mechanic called out, "Sir, this thing's warming up twice as fast as expected." "Is that bad?" another asked. "No," the mechanic muttered, brow furrowed. "It's weirdly efficient. Like they skipped half the safety steps we rely on." Reddick knew what that meant. The Soviets had chosen speed over certainty. The aircraft was built to launch at a moment's notice, even if every component screamed for mercy. It was meant to fly now, not when checklists were satisfied. During the second cycle test, a fuel pressure gauge on the left panel flickered. "Abort," a tech asked. Reddick leaned into the cockpit, watching the needle dance. "Not yet. This thing's manual. No digital nonsense behind the gauge. It's just a vibrating Soviet sensor." Sure enough, the reading stabilized. Had this been a U.S. platform, automatic lockouts would have grounded the jet. But the Yak's primitive architecture simply didn't care. And that made it dangerous. Because the less an aircraft requires to operate, the harder it is to truly defeat. By the 5th day of reliability trials, Reddick began to see the aircraft not as a crude experiment, but as a philosophical declaration. American designs preached, "Nothing must fail." Soviet designs replied, "Everything will fail. Design accordingly." That difference changed everything. The Yak's wiring was simplistic but robust. Its fuel lines were thick, ugly, but almost impossible to rupture. The landing gear looked fragile until engineers tested the shock absorption and realized the Soviets had built it to survive landings that would snap the legs off an American prototype. Reddick watched mechanics drop the jet from a crane, just a few feet, onto its gear struts. It hit the concrete with a brutal metallic crash. The gear didn't even squeal. "This thing is a farm tractor with wings," one mechanic muttered. And Reddick replied softly, "That's exactly why it's terrifying." Later that afternoon, he was instructed to perform emergency procedures, flameouts, nozzle jams, and asymmetric thrust events. Each scenario was designed to test survivability, not performance. He strapped in again, feeling the familiar claustrophobic pressure of the cockpit. Switches clicked like old typewriter keys. Flare 1. Simulate left lift engine outage at 200 feet. 200 feet. That was suicide in most VTOL aircraft. But orders were orders. He lifted off. The Yak wobbled. At the cue, he killed the left lift engine. The aircraft dropped violently, lurching sideways. Warning lights flashed red. The Soviet control system, primitive as it was, offered no compensation. Reddick wrestled the stick, fighting muscle against metal, instinct against gravity. He redirected thrust through the primary engine, forced the nose down, converted the fall into forward momentum, and clawed stability back at the last moment. Thud! He skidded across the desert floor and stopped in a plume of dust. Silence. The ground crew rushed in, expecting bent metal, torn gear, something catastrophic. But the Yak, stubborn and inelegant as always, sat intact, as if shrugging off the abuse. Reddick popped the canopy, coughing dust. That, he rasped, should have destroyed it. The colonel stared at the aircraft, expression tight. So what's your conclusion, Captain? Reddick wiped a streak of dust from his cheek. Sir, this jet survives mistakes. American designs survive perfection. The colonel didn't answer. He didn't need to. The following week, the Pentagon sent observers, generals, analysts, and defense contractors. Clean uniforms, polished shoes, unaccustomed to the desert heat. They walked around the Yak as if it were some exotic creature dragged from a distant jungle. Reddick briefed them, repeating the findings, the weaknesses, the strengths. But the reactions were predictable: raised brows, dismissive smirks, polite skepticism. A contractor from Lockheed tapped the fuselage. You're saying this crude contraption is strategically dangerous? Reddick held his gaze. Yes, sir. Not because it outperforms us, because it doesn't have to. A general frowned. Are you implying the Soviets don't care about pilot safety? They care about outcome, Reddick replied. They build for the war they expect to fight. We build for the war we want to fight. Another general interjected. Captain, surely you're not suggesting our advanced jets are inferior. Reddick inhaled. No, sir. They're superior. Brilliant. Technological masterpieces. But brilliance is fragile. This, he tapped the Yak with a knuckle, isn't. The room fell silent. Finally, the colonel stepped in. Gentlemen, Captain Reddick's evaluations will inform future doctrine, not replace it. Take the findings under advisement. Which, Reddick knew, was military code for. We'll file this somewhere quiet. The final day of Project Have Flare arrived without ceremony. The Yak sat on the runway once more, bathed in morning sunlight, its dull paint reflecting nothing. Reddick walked around it slowly, hand tracing the riveted panels one last time. He remembered the first hover, the violent shakes, the near falls, the impossible saves, and he realized something that unsettled him more deeply than any maneuver. The Yak-36 was a reminder of how far technological arrogance could blind a nation. America's jets relied on pristine runways, specialized technicians, miles of spare parts, rivers of fuel, and supply chains stretching across oceans. The Yak needed almost none of that. It asked for so little. It gave so much. And it could appear anywhere. In a forest clearing, on a broken road, behind a factory, inside a warehouse. A swarm of them, not good, but good enough, could cripple a far superior force. Not by defeating it in air-to-air combat, but by surviving long enough to strike again. Reddick climbed into the cockpit for the last scheduled flight. A simple hop, a final hover, the symbolic closing of the project. But something shifted inside him. When the tower cleared him for takeoff, he lifted gently, rising into the hot Nevada air. The ground fell away. He hovered at 30 feet. Then he spoke, his voice steady. Groom Tower, this is Flare 1. Request permission for an unrestricted climb. A long pause. Flare 1, that's not in the test card. I know, but I want to see what's left. What's really in this machine? Silence. Then, quietly, permission granted. Reddick pushed throttle. The Yak roared. He shot upward, 40 feet, 100, 500, until the desert became a painted blur. At 10,000 feet, he leveled off, letting the airframe breathe. He felt the aircraft's heartbeat, the rough thrum of the lift engines, the steady pulse of the main turbine, the honesty in its simplicity. He whispered, "You stubborn, brilliant little beast." Then he initiated descent. As he lowered through 3,000 feet, the turbulence hit hard. The Yak wobbled. Violent side gusts shoved the fuselage. Warning lights flared. He corrected. The jet fought. He corrected again. At 200 feet, The crosswinds intensified. The Yak pitched dangerously. One moment it felt recoverable. The next, the lift engine stuttered. Reddick's instincts flared. Throttle, counter thrust, roll correction. The aircraft dropped 10 feet in an instant. Then 5 more. Then, whomp, a cloud of dust exploded around him. The landing gear slammed into the ground. The fuselage creaked. But the Yak, once again, survived by brute stubborn strength. Reddick's breath shook. He shut down the engines. Mechanics sprinted in. A paramedic knelt by the cockpit. "You okay, Captain?" Reddick opened the canopy and let the wind hit him. "I'm fine," he said. "The plane?" The mechanic examined the gear. Scratch paint. Nothing structural. Of course it had lived. 2 days later, the Yak-36 was crated for transport to a classified storage facility. The project was complete. Reddick stood alone beside the crates as they were sealed. An engineer approached. "You're really going to miss that ugly thing." Reddick exhaled. "It taught me something." "Yeah? What's that?" "That in war, sophistication is a luxury." He looked at the closing crate. "And simplicity is a weapon." The engineer nodded slowly. "So what'll happen to it?" Reddick shrugged. "It'll sit in a warehouse. A reminder. Maybe someday someone will read the reports and understand." Reddick watched the forklift carry the crate away. "Maybe," he said softly. "Maybe not." Years later, long after he retired, long after new generations of U.S. fighters crowded the skies with their digital brilliance, an aviation historian reached out to him. She held a dusty report labeled half flare. She had found his handwritten notes, his warnings, his insights. "Captain Reddick," she asked, "what was the most important lesson you learned from flying the Yak-36? Reddick looked out the window at the shimmering desert. "That perfection is fragile," he said, "and that the side willing to embrace imperfection may outlast the side chasing perfection." She smiled. "And the Yak itself? What was it really?" Reddick thought about the trembling hover, the brutal acceleration, the cheap steel, the crude design, the improbable strength. "It wasn't the best aircraft," he finally said. "Just the most survivable." He paused. "And in war, survivability wins."